Carl Zimmer, thank you so much for being here with us in La Repregunta.
Thanks for having me.
Carl, couple of days ago, a week more or less, you tweeted asking a question to virologists. You said, virologists, is there any other virus out there that it is weird in terms of its range of symptoms? And thinking of this question, should we change the way of thinking about coronavirus? Is it still pulmonary or respiratory disease or not?
We're still getting to understand this virus, and there are a lot of things that are taking us by surprise. So, for example, people thought of this as just kind of like pneumonia, a disease of the lungs. But then it became clear that there were a lot of other symptoms. People who get COVID-19 often have serious problems with their kidneys. They have serious problems sometimes with blood clotting. It can lead to strokes in young people. And so there are many, many, many symptoms that are only now just coming to light because this is a brand new virus. This is a brand new disease. And it's still taking us by surprise.
Carl, you know a lot about viruses and the diseases that they provoke. Is it common that the virus causes this kind of wide range of symptoms?
Well, I've talked to virologists, and they say that a lot of viruses can be kind of weird, and they can have a range of symptoms. And certainly, there are a lot of viruses where some people have few symptoms and other people have very severe symptoms. Mm-hmm. So it's not that this is, a virus unlike anything that we have ever seen before. It's a virus, and it does what viruses do, which is infect us. It's just that the particular symptoms that it causes and the risks that it poses to us are new. And, there's no manual that tells us what to do and what to expect from this virus. So, unfortunately, doctors just have to observe their patients and see what happens. And this is very frustrating for them, too, because a lot of their standard practices don't seem to work the way they wanted them to. So, for example, there's a big debate about whether how useful ventilators are for certain patients. There may be situations where someone you might think should be on a ventilator, but in fact, they're still able to talk and so on, even though their oxygen levels are low. So maybe there needs to be some other approach to people like that. So this is a debate that's just going on right now among doctors. They don't have a clear answer yet, but we've only been dealing with disease for a couple months.
Carl, could you say that there has been a change in the way of conceiving the disease and the virus? In terms of, first they were focused, as you were explaining, on lungs, and now they are thinking on the process that is going on blood when the virus is infecting our bodies.
Yeah, well, there's a whole lot of different interactions that the body is having with the virus. It doesn't start infecting us in the lungs. It probably starts actually in the nose. Scientists can see how they can invade cells in the nose. It makes its way down into the lungs, but then there may be receptors, these little surface proteins on cells in other parts of the body, in the gut, for example, in the kidneys, that the virus may be able to attach to. And so, after causing symptoms in the lungs, it may then be able to go on and cause other symptoms. Many people who are sick with COVID-19 report diarrhea. That might be because of the virus getting into the intestines. With the kidney problems, that's, sometimes people have to go on dialysis. Yeah. And so there are a number of other issues.
This is very important, this distinction of the symptoms, because at the beginning of the epidemic and the pandemic, there was a kind of war on ventilators. countries were trying to steal each other the amount and the provision of ventilators. And this idea of flatten the curve, which is related not to stopping the pandemic, but to try to help the health system to be ready in case the amount of cases increase in a very exponential way. Well, in general, the governments and people running, the specialists running the systems, are thinking of getting supplies. One of these clue supplies, or very important supplies, was ventilators. Once the knowledge has increased in relation to the symptoms, would be interesting to be thinking of machines for dialysis, for example, instead of just ventilators?
It's still a matter of debate about when to put someone on a ventilator with COVID-19. Some doctors say, you should get people on a ventilator as soon as possible. Other doctors are saying, well, these people actually are not fitting the profile of the kind of people we put on ventilators before. They're more like people suffering from altitude sickness. It seems that people with COVID-19, even if they have low oxygen rates, they're not able to get that much oxygen into their lungs, it seems like they're still able to get a lot of carbon dioxide out. And that's actually very important in terms of your lungs, because otherwise your blood will get toxic. And so this is something that you would experience if you went to the top of the Andes. You would get altitude sickness, and that calls for a different kind of treatment. You don't put someone with altitude sickness on a ventilator. So, it's possible that if some alternative treatment does turn out to be better, that maybe people will not need as many ventilators. But it's too early to say that yet.
Because it seems that if the health systems are just focusing on getting ventilators, maybe they are missing another very critical resources and items that they could be very useful and critical in the future. But now they're thinking of them.
Yeah, but you have to understand the disease first before you know what kind of resources you're going to need.
Oh, that's a big question there. So, another question. Yesterday we saw the director of the National Institute of Allergies and Infectious Diseases, Anthony Fauci, who has become really famous all over the world, telling in a very optimistic way that the Remdesivir, this drug used for Ebola, is working really well and could be recommended as a treatment for COVID-19. It was very surprising that this official announcement was so optimistic and rosy. Do you agree with it?
Well, I mean, we need to see the detailed results. So far, all we've been able to see is a press release from the National Institutes of Health and Tony Fauci's description of some of the results. One of the really important things to bear in mind is that these results are coming out of what are known as randomized clinical trials. This is the gold standard for understanding what can treat a disease or not. There's been a lot of anecdotes where doctors have a very sick patient and they try one thing, they try another, and something seems to work. That's not enough to know if it really does work. You need to be looking at hundreds, even thousands of people in a single trial, and you have to give some people a drug and some people a placebo, and you can't even let the doctors know which is which. And if you do that, then you can start to look for statistical signals of whether something works or not. Are people who are getting the drug surviving more than people who aren't, and is that it's statistically significant? So, at least from what Dr. Fauci has said, I believe the mortality in the people who got the placebo was 11%, and the mortality in the people who got remdesivir was 8%. It wasn't statistically significant yet, but it was approaching it. And also the average time that people were sick with COVID-19 was reduced by several days, and that was statistically significant. So that is the sort of that's the kind of positive result that you often get in these sorts of trials. I think it's good news. It's obviously not a panacea.
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of people who take remdesivir may still die. And if you're in the hospital for 8 days instead of 11 days, that's nice. But obviously you're still in the hospital for a while, and this disease has a long-term recovery process. So, I think what was significant was that this was the first drug shown to actually have an effect on COVID-19 in a randomized clinical trial.
I was asking about this article. You have just published it. It is all drugs may find a new purpose fighting the coronavirus, and you are, describing the antipsychotic drugs, no?
There are drugs that have been used for years or even decades for everything from schizophrenia to coughs to allergies to cancer, all sorts of well-established drugs, some of them in clinical trials for other diseases. And they turn out, if you test them in a dish of cells, that they can stop the virus. And in fact, they seem to be much more potent than remdesivir. Now, that's just tests in cells, so that has to be then moved on to animals and then moved on to randomized clinical trials in people to see if any of these really do work. But, I think we should just look at remdesivir in this initial result as being, let's hope, the first of a series of antivirals that prove more and more effective against the disease.
Carl, why is so difficult to find a drug, an antiviral of a wide spectrum compared to penicillin with bacteria? Does it exist, an antiviral of this kind?
Yeah, it is unfortunate. We think of drugs as being like penicillin, a magic bullet. It just so happens that a whole lot of bacteria just use the same molecules to build their walls, and penicillin can attack them all. We were lucky that way. But antivirals need to basically stop a virus from using our cells to make more viruses. And so it has to lock onto molecules in a very precise way. And, viruses are molecularly very different from each other. We think of them as all being basically the same, but they're not. And so, a virus, an antiviral that works, we have antivirals that work against hepatitis, work quite well. You're not going to be able to take that to cure a cold or the flu. It doesn't work because they just can't lock on. And so it's, some scientists have said, well, maybe there are broad antivirals out there that we haven't found yet, universal antivirals, but, no one's found them yet.
Okay. Carl, you have said when describing the symptoms, the wide range of symptoms that the coronavirus produces, that the new symptoms discovered or recorded are impacting mainly in young people. It's at the beginning of the epidemic, not only the World Health Organization, but specialists all around the world and governments, and they still saying that young people are not that affected as elderly people. But the data is changing another scenario?
Well, I think that initially when people looked at the data coming out of China where the outbreak first started, you could see that old people were much greater risk than young people. And so it sort of got simplified into saying if you're young, then you don't need to worry about it. And that's just not the case. That never was the case. And it's not the case now. So unfortunately, young people, young adults, can get extremely sick. I mean, we have reports in the United States of, some young people having strokes from COVID-19, young people going onto ventilators and never coming off and dying. I mean, it's a disease to take very seriously, not just to so that you don't make an old person sick, but that you yourself stay healthy as well. It does seem that children don't very, very rarely develop serious symptoms. They very rarely die of COVID-19. Nobody knows why. I look at, I suppose because I have children, I look at that as at least one relief. But the fact is that children, there's a debate about, well, does that mean the children just aren't getting infected, or are they getting infected but just never having the symptoms?
Yeah.
And then the question is like, well, if your child gets sick, gets infected, could you pick it up from them?
Yeah.
And that's a big question.
And there is another new big question, Carl, that says there is a study just published that says that children, we think, or scientists thought at the beginning of the epidemic, mainly in Italy, that they maybe were not showing symptoms, but they were the secret vectors of the infections to the other people, adult people, grandparents, and parents. But now there's some data showing that children are not that contagious. What do you know about this?
Well, I've seen these studies, and they're coming to different conclusions. That people, none of these studies seems to be flawed, according to the public health experts I've been following. So it's just, we have to. The problem is that sometimes, you can do a small preliminary study and do it well and still get the wrong answer. That's just the nature of science. It's the nature of looking at small data sets. So if you only look at 50 or 100 people and draw a lesson from that, then, maybe once people have looked at 10,000 or 100,000 people, the picture might turn out to be very different. Yeah. So this is a live debate, and it's really, our children getting infected and then passing it on to their families or to other adults. It's a huge question because if we're closing down schools, and we want to think about reopening them, are we putting people at risk, or is it no big deal because the kids will be fine and they won't pass it on? We have to get an answer to that. Or, we could make a big mistake. It's terrible to keep children out of school. We really need to end this as soon as we safely can, but we don't know if it's safe.
Carl, there's a lot of big questions here, and regarding to the open of the society and economy, there are many of them related to immunity. Some countries are thinking of release certificates of immunity, but there is a big debate around if immunity is built after being sick and recover. What information do you have?
Well, really what scientists have had to rely on is other viruses. Again, this is a virus that, people have just gotten sick with. It's never affected our species before. So all we can do is try to gauge what happens with other viruses. And with other viruses, immunity is a very complicated thing. Sometimes you get sick with something and you develop a lifelong immunity to it. You never get it again. In other cases, like influenza, you can become immune to this year's strain of influenza, but next year you might get sick from another strain. Mm-hmm. And then the year after, maybe you don't get the flu because the old strain came back. So it's complicated. And then there are actually some diseases where if you get sick with it, you're actually more prone to get sick with it later. So we don't know. We just don't know what this new coronavirus means for our immunity. The best guess that I've heard from experts is that probably people will have a year or 2 or 3 at least of protection. Which is great. And that it's promising for a vaccine too. But we can't. It would be a mistake to sort of rush out and say like, oh, you've been exposed to the virus, and now you have some antibodies. Therefore, you're invincible.
But we don't
know that.
because the debate around when to stop with the quarantine, when to open the economy again is a big debate in many, many countries because of the economic impact. Do you think that the idea of based on certificate of immunity, well, it could be the rational way to decide the ending of quarantine and isolation is not, we are not ready to do this?
Well, no, I think you have to remember that, the scientists are now trying to measure how many people have actually been exposed to the virus. And the estimates, there's a lot of debate about how good these studies are, but I think it's safe to say maybe 5%, 10% of people, depending on where you're looking, may have been exposed to it. We couldn't say like, okay, well, the 5 or 10% of people who have been exposed, they're allowed to go to work and everyone else has to stay home. I think it would be really hard to support an economy on 5% of the population. It just wouldn't work.
Yes.
So, so what scientists have been proposing, on the other hand, is to say like, okay, like once rates are going down in a country or a state, and they've been going down for a while, and once you have enough testing in place so that you can see if there are any new flare-ups, then you can try to start opening up slowly and see with each measure, are things staying safe or are you leading to more flare-ups? If you do get those flare-ups, you need to stop them as quickly as possible. And that requires massive testing, and it requires, maybe other ways of monitoring the virus, and it requires what's called contact tracing, where people go out and they just, once you find someone who's sick, you figure out who have they been in contact with for, more than 10 minutes, say, in the past few days.
Could be the case, Carl, that after testing people and, prove that they have been contagious and they have been infected and they didn't die. So could be the case that we, in the future, with this information, realize that the mortality rate or the lethal rate is lower or is the same that the common influenza? And the problem is that we don't have the proper information and the amount of information to sustain this hypothesis.
No, I think we can be confident that this is much more lethal than influenza. We know that. Even if these antibody tests are, they're still rough. They're still preliminary. But we have enough information to know that it's much more lethal than influenza, and it causes a much wider range of these symptoms that we were talking about before, even for the people who don't die. So no, so we can't say, oh, it was just the flu after all. It's not. It's much worse.
Hey, Carl, you're a specialist in virus. You have written a very interesting book. I recommend reading it, A Planet of Viruses. And there are many stories in that book telling how present our viruses are in our planet. How many viruses are just right now in the planet? Is there a final count?
Well, they're just estimates. If you scoop up just a spoonful of water, there are just countless viruses, even just in a spoonful of water. And so scientists have tried to go from those sorts of measurements to figure out how many viruses there are on Earth. And basically you have to take a number 1 and then add 31 zeros after that. Yeah.
A lot of zeros.
Yeah. So, it's by far the most common living thing on Earth. There are far more viruses than bacteria, way more than animals. And they're very genetically diverse. Some scientists have claimed there are trillions of species of viruses. So we've only formally described a few thousand of them. So really it's going to take centuries to describe all of the diversity of viruses.
If we survive to the viruses, no?
Yeah.
Carl, you said living organism. Are they alive or are they dead, or are they something in the middle? Because there is a scientific debate surrounding this issue.
There is a scientific debate. It's been going on for quite a while, and I think it has more to do with how you define life than what you think of viruses. I mean, viruses evolve. Viruses have adaptations to make more copies of themselves. They're very, if you look at the way that they evade our immune systems, they can be very cunning. But, they don't have some things that a cell has, that bacteria have, that we have. They don't grow. They don't eat. They just, for the most part, just deliver genes into cells, and then the cells make more copies of them. So if that's not enough for you, then no, they're not alive. But it seems to me they're certainly part of life.
Mm-hmm. Are they smart? Because this ability to live in a host, and this ability of surviving throughout over the years make them smarter than cockroach and human beings?
Well, it is a testament to evolution that, something that, COVID-19, the coronavirus, has only 29 genes. We have over 20,000 genes, and yet just these little 29 genes are enough to basically bring our entire global society to a halt. So that's pretty impressive. Mm-hmm. It certainly is remarkable that our bodies, even when we're healthy, are home to many viruses. A lot of those viruses, trillions of them, are not infecting our cells, but are infecting the bacteria that live inside of us. Mm-hmm. And so they're probably pretty important to our health because they will keep these different species of bacteria in check by infecting them and killing them. And so we have our viruses inside of us to thank in part for our health, maybe.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye.